Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I have a very special guest from the UK with me, Chloe Combi. And I
Hello.
met doing a podcast or something together a while back, and I was fascinated by you and your work with Generation Z, or as known in the UK, Generation Z. Uh,
Yeah.
and uh, and I recently saw a piece you did on Andrew Tate on your newly established Substack, and I was like, we should really chat and
Mm.
introduce you to my audience, and hopefully your audience will get to know more about me. Let's see what else. So you're a futurist. Your book is Generation Z or Z, Their Voices, Their Lives, and you have a forthcoming book out in 2024, How to Save the World.
Hmm.
That's my kind of book. So I'm very much
Ambitious.
aligned. Yes, ambitious. And the world needs saving, frankly. There's a lot of dark forces and a lot of confusion, and the internet and predators and malignant narcissists. Let's see you. So let's see. You have a number one Apple podcast. What's your podcast name?
It's called You Don't Know Me, where I
You,
interview many members of Generation Z
mm-hmm.
and also Generation Alpha or Generation A about lots of different issues. So it's very kind of relevant if you're a parent or a teacher or interested in young people in the future.
Definitely, they are our future. And I
Mm.
recently interviewed a lawyer, Marcy Hamilton, who is the CEO of ChildUSA.org, the only world think tank proposing children should have rights. They should not be regarded as property. And
Yes.
so we have, someone who's trying to work through the courts and abolish statutes of limitations and such. So let me just finish introducing you. I already mentioned your books. You've directed films for Meta. You're a global speaker, a brand and political consultant, and even advised on an American presidential campaign. Which one, may I ask?
I'm not actually allowed to say,
Oh,
but when
okay.
I do kind of consultancy, sometimes I have to
That's
sign an NDA.
no
So I
problem.
can tell I've done a couple, and I did have for both of them have to sign an NDA because it was really interesting. The work wasn't particularly secret,
Yeah.
and I will be doing something a bit more visible. But we were particularly focusing on how to turn younger voters who might be very active online into actual in the booth voters. So that was
Yep.
super interesting. So I did kind of about 9 months on that. But unfortunately,
Wonderful.
I am under an NDA still.
No worries. I know about NDAs on good NDAs that are make sense, and bad ones like cults have people sign them so they can't sue them and take
This
them
was
to
definitely one of
court.
the good guys. This was
Yeah,
one of the
no,
good guys, and it was definitely on the left. It wasn't, Trump.
I wasn't going to make you say, but that's all good. So as you know, my podcast is called The Influence Continuum because I talk about influence from ethical, informed consent influence that respects conscience and critical thinking and free will and the freedom to leave or to question the authority, and all the way to the unethical, destructive, authoritarian side. And so for me, some are squarely in the undue influence, where I'm interviewing someone who's an ex-member of a cult. And some are squarely in the ethical influence side, like I interviewed someone on parenting, I interviewed someone on gratefulness, and someone on a healthy approach to embodied mind therapy. And for you, I'm wanting to get to know you and your work better. I think that it's going to touch on the whole continuum, really, from your
Mm,
interviews with young people.
mm.
And before we get started, for those listeners who don't know, what is Generation Z? Can you share the definition, and then what the definition of Generation Alpha is? A.
So I think on a very simplistic level, Generation Z or Z are roughly born between the ages. There's a little bit of flexibility, but 1996 to sort of 2008, 2009. So they're roughly kind of 12, 13 to the ages of 24. and then Generation Alpha or Generation A would be 2008/9 to 2020. I think putting newborn babies into generations is probably a little bit premature. And there's, I mean, obviously a lot is made of the fact that these are the first kind of digital generations, but actually I think millennials were the first digital generation. So fundamentally, and I think that's particularly present to this conversation, this is the first generation that were born and raised and came of age with the modern internet in sort of social media and the kind of thought silos and the internet bubbles that we exist in. And I think very presently the absolute wallop influence of essentially social media, which has influenced not just our kind of communication and how we socialize, but everything from the music we like, how we vote, and I think increasingly how we think. So this was absolutely a generation that were not in any way born in the analog world. They came of age completely digitally and were shaped and formed in the fire of that, and all those things that are kind of good, and quite a lot of the kind of the dark and toxic stuff too.
Yeah, and my listeners know I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm 68, and so I remember this thing called the internet before it was a thing, and one of my clients had an uncle who was a computer scientist who said, you need to be on this thing, and he created a website. I think the first
interweb.
one was Hassan net or something. In any case, I mean, I didn't get into video gaming. Like, I did Pac-Man for like 20 minutes, and I was like, this is boring. It just didn't interest me. But I have a 20-year-old son, and we did everything we could to try to delay his acquisition of a smartphone. When he was in middle school, we were advised to give him a flip phone. And of course, as soon as he could, now he's totally addicted and won't listen to dad, no matter what I try to say about, bad actors on the internet. Another very fascinating interview, Chloe, that I did was with a Harvard psychiatrist and social neuroscientist, Carl Marcy. He wrote a book called Rewired. It's a Harvard University book.
I've read that.
The effects on young minds, and all the specialists say keep them off screens for the first 3 years, even with TV or iPads or whatever, because they need that interaction with human beings. Those mirror neurons need to develop and be pruned, and of course children need to feel loved, and like they're the focus of the attention of a loving adult.
I mean, honestly, I think that in terms of smartphone addiction and our addiction to screens, we're kind of in that 1950s/60s phase that happened with the cigarette industry, where they were kind of going, no, it's fine, pregnant women have cigarettes, everybody should smoke. And I think that they're really holding back, actually, the extent that they can damage kind of cognitive development. I think there's absolutely no debate over the fact that they really affect our concentration. And I think the thing that's really coming out now, and I have interviewed, I think I've interviewed more members of Generation Z and young people than anyone. I've done over 10,000 interviews. And I think the extent, and this is globally, and it's very, very apparent in places where there is very widespread social media and smartphone use, is the amount it affects our mental well-being and our mental health. And I think the impact on, as you sort of say, neurological development and happiness, but also depression and well-being, in a sense of liking yourself. And it's very apparent that the more time a young person spends on social media, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, the less they seem to like themselves. And also, and I think this connects to what we're going to talk about, the angrier and or sadder they get, and there's huge commodity in rage and sadness, and that's what gets people to kind of stay and click and buy things and read things, and they're really exploiting that with young people. And it really, so when you are sad, when you are angry, particularly when you're younger, you're exponentially more likely to not only spend more time on that particular site, but purchase things and kind of go deeper. And that's how they make kind of their money. So they're literally commodifying both
Yep.
young and youthful sadness and rage. And that's quite a difficult message to get through to them, but that absolutely is a thing that they can modify.
Yeah, and I love the Social Dilemma documentary where
Yeah.
Tristan Harris, the Google ethicist, went into interviewing former executives of social media platforms and AI, algorithms. And for me, because my background getting out of a cult, I had to learn about undue influence, and it goes back to Edward Bernays, which I wrote about in The Cult of Trump. And he basically said, you need to create a need and then you can sell a product. So
Yeah.
nobody knew their house needed Glade air spray, petroleum product, but they invented housetosis. Oh, the house smells terrible. So everyone's going around and needing to buy this thing. And before that, it was just normal, healthy human smells. Mom's cooking. Go ahead.
Do you think there's a similarity between physical cults, of which the one you escaped, and the cultish aspects of our need to be on social media? Yeah, and establish followings and kind of be a figurehead who's influential. Do you think would you say that, TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, to a lesser extent Facebook or Twitter, are kind of a bit like modern day cults that that more people are members of?
So, I think about the influence continuum from ethical to unethical, and each thing needs to be evaluated on its own. That's the expert witness in me wanting to be more accurate. But I can tell you that I started researching in detail cult recruitment online in 2015, and specifically ISIS recruitment online. And so I came to understand how it worked, and it was a digitalization of what cults were doing in physical, in IRL, in real life, and replicating it online. A big difference, though, is back when I was a cult leader in the Moonies, we had to ask people about their backgrounds. They had to disclose mom and dad divorced or so and so happened. And I was taught a paradigm of thinker, feeler, doer, believer to try to assess where the buttons would be that would be most effective to get people involved with the moon cult. Well, this is now with Cambridge Analytica and hacking people's private information and AI and companies like Glue in Colorado that collect this dark data and sell it to third parties. We're entering a whole nother level of manipulation and mind control. And I think you're absolutely right about the early days of the tobacco industry, where they would hire doctors to smoke and they would hire actors to smoke, and which is coming back again, by the way. I'm seeing that more and more in films and TV series, a lot of cigarette smoking, which is upsetting. But yeah, so the bottom line is the greed model of capitalism that says, caveat emptor, everybody should beware, and if you get fooled, it's on you. That's why I think we do need regulations to protect our data privacy, to hold platforms accountable for deleterious effects on people. And there are lawsuits that I'm reading about now going against the social media companies. And I think there's like a lot of data that can support these lawsuits. And they want to try to undermine the government so there won't be regulations. So the more they can create chaos and confusion and disorientation. And I think, if I read correctly, Facebook has 1,500 full-time lobbyists in Washington, D.C. There's something way over 1,000. And the politicians are not looking out for the kids and looking out for their constituents. And that's part of the problem.
And what's quite infuriating is in Silicon Valley, in the kind of schools that, the titans of technology send their own children to, because obviously they're of the age now where most of them have young children, or probably middle school age children, or if not slightly younger, they're more often than not screen-free schools, because they're happy to expose your children and your teenagers to the damaging effects of screens and social media, but because they're aware of the negative cognitive impact and the negative impacts on self-esteem and all those kind of things that are super important for development. And I know that there's kind of lots of tales on the internet, but by all accounts quite a lot of them avoid screens themselves, and obviously know very well about how much data they take and how much we're being watched. And not to get too conspiratorial, but I think that in the next 10 years certainly we'll become much more aware of the impact of all of this, and I think it will be quite a scandal, because obviously the whole kind of Cambridge Analytica thing was massively scandalous, but weirdly I don't think it impinged perhaps on people maybe outside the kind of the newsy and political bubble. And I think where people will really react if it suddenly becomes evidentially clear that it actually impacted on their child's intelligence or well-being, or their teen's intelligence or well-being. And I think that information probably will come out certainly in the next decade.
Yep, I agree with you. I'd like to share, if I may, I was at an autism conference to learn about working with folks on the spectrum many years ago, and I met a author of a book called Neurotribes. His name is Steve Silberman, Chloe.
Okay.
And his thesis was basically that people like Bill Gates and Stephen Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg are all on the spectrum, and folks who are on the spectrum have very specific comfort zones, and creating an environment that's digital where they don't have to interact with people directly, face to face. So his thesis way back when was that the neurotypicals are being rewired to be more spectrum-y, because they're uncomfortable. I mean, and I see young people sitting next to each other, texting to each other, instead of
absolutely
turning to each other.
I mean, I think it's. I mean, obviously, this is something for the medical industry, but certainly, I think autism is becoming more common, and there's a possibility. I think, obviously, that perhaps because we're better at understanding it or diagnosing it. But I absolutely agree that, autism aside, because obviously that's not my field, but it's massively rewiring how our brains work and how we communicate. And I genuinely do think that one of the most obvious things is our level of, two things actually, is our levels of concentration. I think that ability for people of all ages just to recall really simple information, and information that, a conversation that happened this morning if it's the afternoon, let alone times tables or recalling kind of historical facts, or being able to memorize a poem. But I think the other one, without a doubt, is rage. I mean, the manipulation of the globe's emotions, because we spend all this time on social media, is very apparent. And I think it's because, and maybe it affects you more when you're young, but absolutely everything now requires not just a response from you, but an extreme response. And again, it's that kind of manipulation, because sadness and anger are the sort of profitable emotions, if you like. But it's not a natural state to be in. That I think 20 or 30 years ago, maybe you had an extreme reaction. It's difficult to know, but a couple of times a day. But now, because of the notifications and the fact that we spend a lot of time online, you had this expectation that you have to react to so many things a day. And I think it's both exhausting people, sort of mentally and emotionally, but it's making them so much angrier. And I think that's starting, and maybe that was less apparent in the pandemic, but I think post-pandemic, with all those other things, we're just at this insane levels of rage that you see both online, but you're starting to see in the physical world as well, which is quite worrying.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And I'd say the more we're functioning out of our amygdala, our part of our brain that is supposed to keep us safe, it's getting overstimulated. and people are lacking the frontal executive, functioning part to analyze, is there's actually danger, or is this a phobia? Like, is the source of this information that's making me upset even real and verified?
Yes.
Or am I just getting triggered and emotionally wanting to connect with my network and be the first one to retweet something or to like something or whatever? So there really is, I haven't read the draft of your new book yet, but for me, learning about the mind, learning like being in your body, being in the here and now, having a balance of our critical thinking, our heart, our intuition, and our gut, and having a healthy network to bounce things off of, including having people in our network that don't agree with us politically, but that we respect and they respect us, where we can actually open our minds to the idea that maybe we believe things that need to be changed.
No, absolutely, and I mean, I think that that's the other thing, that the sort of the online world has completely failed to replicate real life friendship groups, because I think people do think of quite often their Twitter following or their Facebook friends or the people that followed them on Instagram or TikTok as their friendship groups, and certainly I think possibly older people, maybe who've started to go out less, have developed these very intense bonds. And you see that a lot, with the whole, QAnon thing, that they genuinely believe that they're kind of in this intimate tribe and they alone sort of see the truth. But it's not a real friendship group, is it? It's a kind
Correct.
of, there's a massive difference between a friendship group and an online tribe. But interestingly, I see real parallels between this sort of, for example, I think the QAnon phenomenon is a really interesting example. This is kind of, we're in this tribe and we see this truth and we are kind of the enlightened ones. And that was what really interested me. I mean, I started noticing this Andrew Tate thing about a year ago. And I remember writing about it and sort of talking to sort of friends, but more explicitly young people in schools. And he was using very, very similar techniques to religious extremism, but also the language of the QAnon cult, which is, you are the enlightened and chosen one. And aside from we'll get to the content of what he was saying, but if you see and agree with what I'm saying, you are enlightened and you're visionary and you see this. And it was absolutely no coincidence, really unoriginal, that he pinched the ideas of the Matrix, the kind of the red pill and the blue pill. And for anyone who hasn't seen the film, in the film, Neo is offered a red pill and a blue pill. The red pill leads you to kind of this enlightenment, detaching from the Matrix, and in the blue pill you stay in the artificial world that you already exist in. And it's really interesting that the Matrix has kind of been hijacked somewhat by this kind of these right-wing movements, because actually the films were by these trans women and they're very liberal, and they by all accounts represented very liberal ideas. And it's not terribly original that, people like Andrew Tate are using this idea of kind of staying enlightened and also sort of staying in the dark. But the way that they've lifted the metaphor is attached almost to this kind of men's rights movement, that men or people who are blue pilled believe that feminism is good for you, and that that there is equality and you should sort of strive for these kind of progressive, or I hate that word because it doesn't mean anything, but woke ideals. And the red pill is that you are freed from the bonds of wokeism, and you go back almost to these kind of almost more old fashioned binary ideas about all kinds of things. But it's not so much even the stuff that he was saying, which is a lot of it is just nonsense, and it's dangerous and it's unoriginal and it's just BS. But it is effective, and you could see it was being effective because he was smart enough to kind of use these strategies of indoctrination and tribalism. And in an age where I think lots of different generations are feeling very disenfranchised and very isolated for lots of different reasons, but particularly post-pandemic, anything. And QAnon, the QAnon movement, really understood that, and that was a hoax in the same way that I think Andrew Tate and all these people kind of understand that it's kind of quite hoaxy. And a kind of then the movement takes off and they're like, whoa, that really works. So they kind of go further and further with it. But it's very similar techniques. It's all about you are alone, you are isolated, you are feeling sad and you're feeling bad about yourself. Join us and we will kind of to take you to a sort of sense of enlightenment, and you will join a crew and you'll never be alone again. And it's almost kind of secondary what you believe. It's the whole kind of, it's the joining thing. And I think that that's kind of being missed. So it's not even him that's the most important thing. It's what it says about mostly boys who have clearly got this very, very strong need to be part of a movement and have these strong male role models. And that is the thing I think we should be striving to understand much more than this kind of cultish figure who will, in 6 or 9 months, particularly if the Romanian authorities have their way, be slightly irrelevant. But the trouble is then there'll be a next one, because there's always a next one. And, and Trump is a bit like Tate and, all those kind of things. And clearly in these kind of lonely, disconnected times, there are definitely a certain type of person that's really attracted to those kind of, and they do tend to be men, these kind of strong men.
Yes, so I'll just confirm and say that, it's Cult 101. And when I say cult, I mean destructive Cult 101, having a black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil. We have the truth, we're chosen, everyone else is in darkness. This is since 1976 when I got out of the Moonies. I was understanding, that's the paradigm. And it's just been digitized. I actually did a lot of research on QAnon. I did a bite model of analysis of QAnon as a cult. And it was a psyop, not just a hoax. And I, in fact, talked with one of the founders of Anonymous who knew the 3 people who started it, who said it was a goof on the Trump followers. Sure. And it was only when they realized they could make money selling merch, and then the Russians got involved, that it got co-opted by the Christian right and the Russians. And I believe Russia's involved with Andrew Tate as well. But we are social beings. This notion that humans are individuals and that selfishness is good and greed is good and altruism is evil. That's Ayn Randian cult ideology that a lot of people have unfortunately adopted. And with that, a notion of social Darwinism, like, well, I have more money or I have more followers, therefore I'm better than you, which is... And that's a big difference between, back to your point about real friends versus online friends. Real friends accept you for who you are. They may not agree with everything you do, but they care about you fundamentally. But on these unethical ends of things, it's all performance. We will love you if you do what we tell you to do, as long as you toe the line, don't ask questions, don't challenge authority. Absolutely. Then you can be part of our group. And the minute you question, like David Weissman, who I wrote about, was a Trump MAGA troll, he self-proclaimed, who woke up and realized, no. And the minute he started questioning Trump, everyone turned on him, all of his pals. And it just confirmed, these are not my friends. They don't care about me. They were just using me. And it's a hard lesson. And this is another piece of it, is there's a stigma currently to people who leave groups, whatever type of mind control cult it is, because the public has this incorrect perception that only weak, stupid people are gullible, people who need something. And the truth is, human beings need other people. They need to feel important. They need to feel a purpose. They need to feel part of a community. And so we're starving for that connection, and our brains can get hacked by being online.
And I completely agree with that. And I think the other thing that's really different between online social groups and real life social groups, and I think this is particularly becoming pronounced with Actually, I don't think it's becoming pronounced just with young people. You see it all over. I think that even 10 years ago, you used to have social groups, whether it was at school or college or the workplace, that were really diverse. You went to a party or a festival or, even a school, and there was a kind of much more of a kind of an easy diversity and a diversity by choice. And I mean, I grew up with lots of different types of friends who had different beliefs and culturally were on a really wide spectrum, and whether that was music or politics or ethics. And I think now, and this is very, very much the case when you go into schools and universities, particularly I think on university campuses, I think schools are still a little bit more diverse, that you see social silos that are replicating, I think, online silos.
Yeah.
And people have this inability to socialize and be friends with increasingly people who are different from them. And I think that is a direct consequence. I think there's sort of complex socioeconomic reasons, but I think a lot of that is a direct consequence from our social media conditioning, and Generation Z and Generation A have grown up online. So they have been socialized online. So inevitably that is going to spill over into their kind of real world social activities. And that's incredibly dangerous, because what happens then is that we all become like our version of Fox News, and everyone exists or will come to exist in a kind of a social silo whereby everybody thinks like them and talks like them and to some extent looks like them and dresses like them and dates like them and loves like them. And we'll all be increasingly suspicious and resentful of people who aren't in our social silo, and that is, that is just a disaster waiting to happen. Because in America, you've already seen the consequences of political silos. Increasingly, people are unable to tolerate people, whether it's at a dinner party or in a traffic jam or in a coffee shop, someone who quite evidently has kind of pierced their social comfort levels. They see, someone wearing like a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or a Trump, Make America Great, and that affronts them because it's different to how they believe. And you're seeing that so much more, and that is definitely something that I think is being mirrored in the UK. I had a dinner party in the summer, and I sort of kind of invited a diverse set of friends, and one of my friends said, I'd really like to come, Chloe, but I can't because someone's going to be there who's an ardent Tory, which is someone who votes Conservative here, which is a bit closer to your Republican Party. And I thought that was both really funny and intriguing, but interesting that and I think America are a little bit ahead of us in that people are like, I'm not coming to dinner or hanging out with anyone who votes
It's not
X,
ahead
Y, or
though.
Z.
It's kind of depressing that it's
behind maybe is
behind,
absolutely.
yes.
It's more extreme, I don't know. But certainly and in Europe, which I think has been traditionally very progressive, you are definitely starting to see the emergence of these kind of social and political and cultural silos. And I genuinely think that that's a consequence of us being socialised online. And I think that became more extreme during the pandemic, when we kind of lost 2 or 3 years of natural physical socialisation.
Yes, I could completely agree. And for me, because I was in a cult and I expressed the same kinds of beliefs as the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. In fact, in my former cult, he said democracy was satanic and we need a theocracy to rule the world and gay people should be killed and sent to the spirit world, and people, I believe that. And that's not who I was growing up as a young Jewish male in Queens, by the way, 1.3 miles from Donald Trump's childhood home. Completely opposite. So for me, also because I'm a therapist too, but I go out of my way to try to model that I'm not threatened to talk with Trump believers or anyone else. And I get attacked like, you're brainwashed, you're in the cult of Soros. And my response is, oh, really? Tell me more. What makes you say that? Like, what specifically do you think? I get curious, in other words, but I'm respectful. but I want to have a conversation about it.
Do you
Chloe.
thinking about the Tate or the QAnon or the Trump thing or Brexit here, which is definitely cultish, do you think that from your experience of leaving a cult that there is a way to break this fever or break this spell, or are we too far gone?
No, it's 1,000%. That's my prescription for how to save the world, is educating everyone how to discern the difference between love and conditional love. We'll love you if you do what we tell you and if you're obedient. A parent raising a child to think for themselves, knowing that the goal is that they grow up and individuate. They need to not, and this other side, they need to believe what we believe, be in the religion we're in, have the political beliefs, and be obedient to us. That's not healthy developmental psychology. So for me, the spirit doesn't like to be lied to. We don't like to be exploited. We don't like to be tricked. And if it's shown to us in a way that can enter our world, that it's not because we're weak or stupid that we believed it, but this is a function of how the mind works. Like, we adapt to our environments and people and values in our environment, and why it's so important to have diversity and have that trust pod of people from many different points of view, where you periodically are like, share something that you believe is really important and persuasive. Let's watch it together and discuss it. Let me share something that I think is really important and persuasive, and let's discuss it. And I'm going to quote Adam Grant, a social psychologist from Wharton, who I just love his books. He wrote a great book called Think Again. And his thesis there is we should separate our egos from our beliefs and just pursue what's true, and be prepared to change our thoughts if there's something that fits reality and serves us better. And for the most part, a lot of people who love each other, like close siblings, family group members, have cut off contact. Often the left, the progressives, have cut off contact with the right, and it propels them deeper into that silo, instead of, and what I've been saying from the beginning of the Trump presidency especially, is like, stay in touch, be warm, remind them of the good times, find the common ground, and just say, listen, I respect you, I love you, I don't understand how you believe what you believe, but I'm prepared to change my mind. Help me understand what were the things that you were using in your mind that made you go from hating Trump to loving Trump. And often it's a video, a propaganda video, or it's a certain silo group on Facebook or whatever. And we unpack it. The other thing, and then I'll stop talking, Chloe, forgive me.
No, it's great.
But the other thing is, I'm really advocating for more former members of controlling relationships or MLMs or trafficking or political cults or therapy cults to start sharing their story. And we can destigmatize the whole thing of, yep, happened to me, but I got out, hashtag I got out, and life's good. I'm so glad to not have to ask permission if I can go visit my mother in the hospital from my superior in the group. It's like, no, I want to follow my heart and my gut and my conscience and my values, and be true to myself and and have a view that's sustainable, that the world is one place, that we're all in one place together, and we are our brother or our sister's keeper, and that we have to be thinking about planetary survival at this point, and not just who's going to win the next election cycle, or operating in a corrupted system that's been corrupted over decades, a very intentional dismantling of checks and balances, at least in the US.
No, I mean, I think that's all good. I think that particularly with young people, and I'm asked this by parents a lot about kind of nefarious online, it's not just this kind of Andrew Tate guy, but there's lots of kind of very influential figures, and not just influential figures, but influential spaces and communities.
Yep.
And I think that's a really good point that you make. That what I say to parents is, how much time does your kid, usually your teenager, spend online versus how much time do they spend with you? And what it's amounting to now, and this is going to be a sort of systematic reordering of how we kind of spend time and prioritize things, that you quite often will get young people who are spending 11, 12, 13 hours not just kind of glancing at their phone. I think, most young people, teenagers, all of us to some extent, are somewhat on our phones all of our waking hours. We're always conscious of our phones and glancing at it and doing all the things that we do on our phone. But I'm talking about conscious on your phone, doing stuff, watching stuff, being on your phone, even if you don't realise you are. And that is going to amount to a huge amount of power and influence. It doesn't matter who it is particularly they're watching, that is going to be wrangling not just their time, but their personality. They're sacrificing time, but also self to whatever kind of internet personality or space they spend a lot of time with. And it's hard yards, I think, sometimes being a parent, when they're young or they're teenagers. And I think the temptation to go, okay, fine, go on your phone, go on your laptop, go on your iPad, because it's easy and it's quiet and you don't get kind of the conflict or the questions or just having to sort of spend time. And one of the things that I really noticed, because I travel a lot when I speak, both recently and pre-pandemic, was when I was in Scandinavia. And Scandinavia has a legendarily very high happiness factor. They really kind of centralize the family. They've got kind of a low divorce rate, lots of good things. It was notable when you went to Scandinavian countries, when you were in like kind of restaurants or public spaces, how much more kind of active the parents were with their kids, and how fewer sort of numbers of kids of varying ages were kind of on phones and screens compared to in the UK or when I travel in the USA. So actually, it sometimes is a kind of a challenge that I put out to parents is not so much who are panicking about figures like Andrew Tate or their teenager or their kind of child spending lots of time online, but it's not so much stopping them from doing it, but it's replacing that obsessive screen time with quality time with them. And that's really interesting when you present that as a challenge, because then it's kind of, I think it then questions or challenges their whole relationship, because it's then, oh my God, I'm going to have to spend time with my kid and I'm going to have to talk to my kid and we're going to have to do activities. But that is an interesting kind of challenge, I guess, for humanity, isn't it? Because when you actually add up how much time and talent and all thought and all the things that we perhaps used to do before smartphones and screen time that we've sacrificed to our phones, and how much we're losing as a kind of a race and in our relationships and our personal relationships, our friendships, and suddenly that ends up with the question of, is this worth it? Do we want to sacrifice all this to tech companies who become trillionaires and trillionaires and trillionaires? And it's not to suggest, we all become Amish and all, go give up sort of phones and screens, because I think that's unrealistic. But it's genuinely being more thoughtful about the mindless scrolling, not just of ourselves, but I guess of our children and our teenagers, and actually thoughtfully replacing that again with human relationships, human contact. And I completely agree with you, and I think it's a long-winded way of saying it's not enough to say to anyone of any age group, don't go on Facebook and go on QAnon groups, or to a young person, don't go on TikTok or YouTube and watch Andrew Tate videos. It's much better to say, let's do something different. There's so many alternatives, and actually I think that's a much better way of breaking the cycle and breaking the addiction to any of these groups or people. And that's kind of often a good piece of advice, I think, to start with, which is very similar to your point about ego and sort of really valuing more important things. And have I got 10,000 followers? Have I got 20,000 followers? 30,000 followers? Which is something we've become very we prioritize, I think, as a human race.
Yep. And I'll just say from my work, if you tell someone don't think of a white horse, they immediately think of it. And if you tell a young person, don't watch this or don't go to that channel, you're telling them to do it. And that's how their brain will hear it. So
Absolutely.
the wording is really important.
And I think just sort of the final point I'll make is, because it's interesting, you were talking about the 70s, that, and that was kind of one of the periods that was so wrapped up in kind of counterculture. And that was, before I was born, but like, the music and the fashion and the drugs and all those things were so synonymous with youthful rebellion. It was really easy to kind of get into counterculture. And I think that was one of the, why cults became so prolific at that time, because they were mirroring that. And that really scandalised older generations, if it was punk record or a tattoo, or you went off to a music festival, you joined a cult, or you got into Charlie Manson, or, the Beatles or the Beach Boys, or all of those kind of things. That was scandalous to older generations. You can't do that now if you're a teenager, which is one of the real pleasures of being young and being a teenager, was annoying your parents or grandparents or teachers. And you can't, modern kids can't do that with music or tattoos or sexuality or music festivals, because modern parents are kind of liberal and cool and probably share the same records or tattoo artists. So this is something I think that's missed an awful lot, that actually figures like Andrew Tate or these kind of, even like someone like Joe Rogan is much more countercultural for young people. And it's much more shocking when their parents go, oh my God, my son or my daughter is actually into this kind of, quite right-wing, online figure who espouses these quite kind of conservative, red pilly ideas. And actually that scandalises the parent far more than, getting a tattoo. And I think quite often that's missed, the countercultural appeal of these spaces or figures online that annoy your parents far more than going off to Glastonbury Festival or something, which you would have done in the 70s or even 80s or 90s.
That's very interesting, and I'm going to think about that some more. But for me, I am a parent of a 20-year-old gay son, I will add. For me, saying, oh, you're interested in Joe Rogan, share with me the latest one you listened to that was interesting, and let's talk about it, and engage in entering their world in
Absolutely.
A way that is respectful.
Absolutely. And I think also when you do that, it pierces the forbidden nature of it. Because how many punk records has forbidding or banning something sold or clothes, or any time you forbid something or ban it, it's, and now on the internet, it's the Streisand effect. It goes astronomical. And if the response is actually, okay, let's share this and understand it, then suddenly it becomes less like the forbidden fruit. And I think that's a really powerful strategy too.
Yeah. And I will add that Joe Rogan had me on in 2015. And
what was that like? What's he like?
And Trumpers are like, you're on Joe Rogan, really? And all of a sudden, I have a little bit more credibility. What was it like? I was in person. I was out in L.A. And interestingly, he found out that I was raised Jewish, so he started asking me about Judaism. And I've never, in my 47 years of doing interviews, had anyone so curious about learning how could I believe in Judaism. And I conveyed that it's not ultra-Orthodox Judaism with the locks on the side of the hair and the black hats. Like, that's not Judaism to me. That was a leftover from the Holocaust and people who are trying to preserve the culture of that age. Anyway, but he invited me to come back on. He promoted my book, Combating Cult Mind Control. And then when the Cult of Trump came out, I was like, I'm going to do Joe Rogan. Hey, Joe. And it's like, sorry, pass. Didn't want to talk about it. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think that actually, that's definitely his sweet spot, isn't it? From the little I know about him, it's exploring things that other people don't ask about. And I guess probably at that point, there was such a zenith of Trump chatter. It was probably, on his show. But yeah, that sounds like it was I bet that was an interesting experience at the very least.
Definitely. And I've been on Fox, and I will not, I mean, I say no to RTTV, Russian propaganda, but years before I did an interview or two for RT. Um, because I want people to understand what I'm teaching and sharing, and that I'm a human being. And I'll just add a quick comment. I was invited to Moscow, and the Soviet Union fell apart, by psychiatrists and psychologists, and my books had been translated into Russian, pirated. And so they wanted to know, all these cults are coming from the West. Like, who are they, and what do we do about it? And so I was presenting my models, and they were like, Dr. Hassan, do you understand? You're describing the whole system of pedagogy of the Soviet Union. And I'm like, yes. And do you understand we would put dissidents in psychiatric hospitals because they were criticizing the regime? Anyway, long story short, oh, you're counseling us. And I was like, if the shoe fits, this is the model. And what people in the public don't understand, if you were raised in an authoritarian government political system, that's how you continue to think, even if you emigrate to Israel or somewhere else.
Yeah.
And especially if you're still listening to the propaganda channels every day, you're going to be still programmed to think along those lines rather than another point of view.
No, of course, and I think there's no point in preaching to the choir, and I completely agree with you. I think again, talking to a bunch of people who can agree with you is crazy, and it's much more challenging to challenge people who aren't necessarily natural converts. But the Russian model is really interesting, and I don't think people have given account for how influential it's become, because their thing is chaos and confusion. And you do see that, oh my God, in so many age groups. And I think it's being replicated by all kinds of kind of political parties, for all kinds of reasons, that it's not necessarily even like left and right, or liberal, or, kind of conservative. It's this notion of everything is kind of chaos, and there is so much information, and there's so much noise that you simply can't distinguish what's real and what's fake anymore. And that is absolutely the case. And I mean, it's really interesting when you talk to young people, and again, I think this is the attraction to these kind of strongmen characters, is this absolute sense of chaos, the sense of not just, I don't know what to believe, but very much almost, it's not really even nihilism, it's just confusion. It's like nothing is real. And I think that is really inherited from the Russian model of just create, flood the zone with complete chaos.
It's Russian, but it's American intelligence too. I'll cite William Lind from the early 1980s, who wrote a paper on the fourth generation warfare, where he said, psychological warfare is going into an area where we need to create distrust in experts, yes, distrust in science, distrust in institutions, in order to create chaos and confusion, which will render people more vulnerable to the authoritarian voice. I've got this. Mm-hmm. I know what needs to happen. And if you're overloaded, and if you are confused and disoriented, and someone is so certain, the certainty thing is a big persuasive piece for anybody, adults too. And for me, I have an allergy to anyone who's certain. Like, I much respect someone who's totally like, I kind of think this, I'm open to that, or, I used to think this and that. I'm much more responsive to people who are self-aware that way.
Yeah, I mean, I did a talk a couple of weeks ago with some 16-year-olds, and there was it was a mix, male and female, and there was a number of boys in there who had become real Andrew Tate converts. And one of them said, and one of my things is being very non-judgmental.
Sure.
You have to listen to people's reasonings. And one of the boys said to me, the reason I like Andrew Tate is because he teaches you how to be better with women and girls, and more girls will fancy you. Okay. So I said to the girls, how many of you put your hands up if on learning that a boy that maybe you even previously liked is really into Andrew Tate, put your hand up if that's make you more likely to make you fancy him or go out with him. Not a single hand went up. And girls that have actually said, no, that would immediately, red flag, put me off. And I said to the boys, there's a bunch of girls there who are, you know, countering what he's saying, that this is not working. And you could see, you know, some of them going, oh, okay. But a couple of them are like, no, it works. And I was like, there's literally a demonstrable group, you know, a group that's telling you exactly the opposite. And they are girls. They're an expert on this, far more than he is. And they just wouldn't have it. So, yeah, again, it's very much this sort of Gen Z, Gen A thing of, yeah, questioning not just kind of fact, but reality. And I think that, again, is a direct consequence of us growing up in the digital world and online, that people can say black is white and white is black and up is down and down is up. And if people are, you know, trust the person enough, or you know, it's, you know, the right kind of mood or time of day, they will question their own senses, and they will very willingly believe what's obviously not true.
Yeah, I love your demonstration in real life, and I would just say from my work, being the strategic interaction person, I would say to that young man, because understanding there are situational, social, contextual pressures that he may need to stick with his guns, to say something like, I'm curious, how long have you been aware of Andrew Tate and this philosophy? If you go back before you ever heard of him, what was your thoughts about girls?
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And then the other thing is, okay, so you feel that way right now. I'm curious, what would you use as markers that would indicate to you it's time to reformulate whether or not Andrew Tate is a reliable actor in your life and actually will produce what is that they promised? And I do this a lot with multi-level marketing cult members who think they're going to make $1 million part-time. And I'm like, so how many months are you willing to keep spending endless amounts of hours, you know, and how much money would you need to make by the end of 6 months before you step back and go, okay, I made a promise to myself. If I don't make X, I'm out. You know, so it's just seeding some things, but encouraging them to think, oh, I should have some criteria for evaluating whether or not this is working for me or not.
No, and I mean, I think the sunk cost principle, I mean, I don't know whether
sunk
it gets
cost
worse
fallacy, yep.
Yeah, and I think it exercises more powerfully on some people than others. But it is very interesting how quickly that kind of worms its way into not everybody, but susceptible individuals. And I think, you know, to get to the QAnon point, it's this kind of falling for things. It doesn't even really matter necessarily what the thing is. There is clearly something. There is a viral level and a viral need in humanity to be part of something. And unfortunately, often, you know, quite nefarious people abuse that. And I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is how that can be turned into something good. And you do see a lot. I mean, you know, so for example, on the flip side of it, a lot of people on the right will say that Greta Thunberg is cultish thinking, and she's indoctrinating young people because she's making them believe that climate exists. And it's really interesting that they you know, on the other side, or they genuinely think, you know, you hear that kind of, you know, the Democrats are an evil cult who want to, you know, turn everything into kind of Sharia law and drag queen story hour in every primary school. So it's really interesting how everything is seen in these kind of terms of I guess, you know, which is great for you, this kind of cultish thinking. So I guess trying to be sympathetic on the flip side, or that feminism is a cult that seeks to kind of, you know, cut all men's balls off and make them into these kind of neutered beings, which, you know, so it is. I guess it's all down to perspective. But again, and I think it's absolutely to your point, a lot of this is about kind of ego, and it's also about education. And I think it's choosing your sources wisely and
Yes.
choosing them kind of fully, not getting into these information bubbles.
Exactly, and I would say that developmentally, what we as psychology people know is more advanced development is the capacity to hold many different paradigms at the same time, holding on to your own, but being able to create models in your mind and step into them and go, oh wow, this is how they're thinking. But
Yeah.
hold your ground on who you are.
Hold the line on what's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think of self as a dynamic, not as a static thing. Anyway, our hour is flown by. You're fascinating.
I know.
I want you to share a little bit more as we wrap up on your prognosis or some of your suggestions for the future, and tell us more about your Substack and other plans that you may be engaged in that you want to share.
Well, I mean, I think that there's, particularly with young people, there's a sort of almost like a battle for the soul. And you've got, on the one hand, when you talk to young people, you've got this very, very visionary, ethical, really uplifting kind of silo who wants to change the world and really feel like they've inherited a bit of a mess and they have a vision for how to improve things, and you kind of see you are seeing changes in sort of politics and culture and this shift away from this very kind of monolithic representation to something that's much more diverse, and much more visionary. But you do have this pull, that's particularly propelled by kind of, the Andrew Tates and the QAnons and the Donald Trumps of this world that do push this idea that everything is about self and nothing matters. And the only thing that matters is kind of, essentially their power, or which is by proxy your power, and everything is about kind of limiting other people. And this, and I don't want to get into this kind of binary good versus evil
Right.
thing at all, but I think there is a battle for this kind of what will win out, sort of hope, or something much darker. And at the moment, I'm actually, sometimes it's difficult to say on days what will win out. And there's been sort of some good signs and some bad signs. So the point being is, don't fall for this idea that every young person is this visionary person who wants to make the world better. That's not true. But do not fall either for this idea that there's this incredible darkness and nothing is going to get better. I think that there is, both can be true at the same time. And in terms of me, I sort of, you can find me at chloecombi.net. I'm on Twitter. I don't really do Instagram. I have a Substack. I have books. I have a podcast called You Don't Know Me, which is really interesting if you're into young people. And I'm always, hired by lots of brands and governments to talk about the future, because I think having this understanding of young people gives you this excellent insight into where we're going. And people mistake futurists. They think that you're saying that you can tell the future, and what you're actually doing is studying the future, a bit like a chemist studies chemistry. So that's kind of where my interest lies. And I think an understanding of next generations gives you, it's about as close to a crystal ball as you can get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And children are our future. So if anyone's a parent, I'm going to go back to your earlier comment about kids are spending 11 hours online. How many hours are you spending with your kid a day, or even a quality half hour a day where the phone's off and you're sharing a meal or doing something together to connect? That's going to be huge. And I know that I'm guilty. My kid growing up was like, Dad, you're on the phone all the time. How come I can't have a phone? And, and I rationalized and justified, I have to do work and da 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 da. But I actually did work before the smartphone was invented. Surprise.
It's all about modeling. Absolutely.
Yes, modeling.
You can't be what you can't see. And if you see someone from a very young age who's always on their screen, it's inevitable that you're going to start replicating that behavior.
Yep, and to stop, so I've started turning off my phone 30 minutes to an hour before I go to sleep at night, so that it's not in my head, that I'm thinking about what I've accomplished that day, and I'm thinking about what I want to accomplish tomorrow, and trying to focus on what I've accomplished versus what I still need to do or feel, like I'm missing out on accomplishing my goals. And so, but life's a journey, and I really do believe there's hope, but a lot of well-intentioned people need to come together and share their,
Absolutely.
respective resources to think about, okay, there are these authoritarian actors wanting to perpetuate cigarettes or perpetuate oil, fossil fuel stuff or whatever, that they're going to keep doing what they want for greed or power. What can we do, that's healthy and normal to turn things in a healthy way? And it really is, the weather, alerts are in our face all the time. We can't just say it's not true anymore. And and now I'm seeing some of the big corporations going, oh, we're working on global climate, but what are they doing? No, they're not. And they're doing excessive profiteering while other people are suffering, and it's just not fair. So thank you for being you, and continued success. And I hope we get to meet in person at some point. And thank you so much for being on the Influence Continuum.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. Take care.